When you're creating a PHP shopping cart like the one shown on this page, once you've actually added the data to the session variables, you need to actually read the session variables and write the data out to the screen in a cart format. So that function would be something like write cart. So let's look at and add the code to our code. So you have an add to cart code, then you have a write cart function. That write cart function is going to take a variable which will determine the different versions of the shopping cart that will be written out depending on what page the shopping cart's being displayed on. So you need both the opening and closing curly brace. The first thing you want to know is if you have any data whatsoever stored for the cart. So I'm going to check, and I'm going to check to see if my session variable product is empty. And if it is empty, so I'm going to do my else first because it's fairly short, then I'm just going to echo out your cart is empty. So you don't see any part of the shopping cart. But if it's not empty, I'm going to actually want to get my session variables. So I'm going to, essentially, just for simplicity, I'm going to take each one of my session variables, which represents an array of data, and I'm going to just store them in a shortened variable. So I'm going to take the session variable prod and store it in a variable called prod, session variable size, and store it in a variable called size. Once I have that written out, then I'm going to actually start to write out my cart. So the first part of writing out my shopping cart will actually be to write out the headers. So I'm going to edit the table. I'm going to give it, it's the same table tag that I would normally create if I was just going to make this in straight HTML. Quite often I find it easiest to create the table, make it look exactly the way I want in HTML, and then copy the code into my PHP so that the styles and the formatting of the table will be attractive. Once I've echoed out my heading, I'm going to want to have a loop to essentially loop through all of the products in my arrays for my session variable. The way you can do that in PHP is I'm going to create a for loop where from I equals 0, and where I is less than, using the count function for arrays, the count of the products in the product array. So essentially there'll be that many products that I've added to my cart will be that count variable. Then I have my open curly brace and my close curly brace, and then I'm going to just simply echo out a row of PHP. So the first few variables are just going to be the straight elements from my session variables. So I'm going to echo a row starter. I'm going to echo the product array element for the array index I, the size, the color, and the price. On the price, I just wrote a $sign on the front of it so that a $sign will appear on in the cell next to the price. I'm also going to put class right. I have a class defined that will align my numbers right aligned. For my quantity, though, on the first version of my shopping cart, I really want my quantity to show up in a text box so that somebody could edit it and update the cart to change that. If I set when I'm writing out my cart, if I set this cnum variable less than 0, so -1, then I'm going to echo out, and I'm going to just put this on a separate line so you can see it, a cell, table cell, input type equals text, name quantity, and when you're writing out this in PHP you want 2 square braces, which tells PHP that this is an array of quantity, a set of quantity text boxes. So all of my text boxes will have the same name, but it'll treat them like an array. And then I'm going to write out the value, and the value is again just going to be the value stored in the quantity array for this particular element. Otherwise, if I'm not this version of my shopping cart and I want to show my checkout version of my shopping cart, so let's just look at the checkout page, I don't want my quantity to be in a text box. So otherwise, I'm going to just echo aligning right my quantity just as a straight variable. Once I've written out my price and my quantity, I want to write out my extended price, which is really just my price times my quantity. Now, sometimes your price times the quantity might not be a round number, or it could be a number that ends in 0.00. If you're going to be writing out currency, you really want everything to be precisely 2 decimal places. So I'm going to use a number format function. I'm going to pass it my number, which is the price times the quantity, and I'm going to format it to 2 decimal places. So that's really everything I want to have in my basic loop. I'm going to echo out my ending of my row, and then that would be writing out one row in my table. The last thing I want to do is I want to keep a running total. So I want to know the total amount that you have in the cart to date, so that I can put an overall total at the end. So if I'm going to echo out the total, I really need to keep a running total. So I have a total variable, which is going to be total plus the price times the quantity for this time through the loop. Whenever I use an accumulator variable in a loop, what I do want to do before I start adding to it is I want to make sure it's 0 before I start the loop, so I can put my total equals 0 here at the top. Now, for my first version of my shopping cart, I then just want to show my subtotal after I write out the whole cart. To show that subtotal, I'm going to write out a whole nother row in my shopping cart using my table cells. My first one, I'm going to column span 5 because I want the word subtotal to be aligned right up next to my subtotal, and then I'm going to number format to 2 decimal places the overall total, so I get a total that's going to show up like that. Now, I also want to write out some buttons, and I'll show you what those buttons do later, but in this particular case, if I'm using, I'm going to use the same kind of if statement as I used previously. If CNUM is less than 0, I'm going to want to write out a set of buttons. And I'm going to do a button that says update cart. It's a submit button. I'm going to do something that is a clear cart. It's just a button. I'm going to do something that's called checkout, which is has a redirect link to take me to checkout.php. The clear cart, I'm going to do a redirect as well, and I'll show you how the clear cart and the update button work in a later tutorial. So that pretty much ends writing out my cart. The last thing I want to do is, otherwise, if it's not this version of the cart, then what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to write out a shipping charge and an overall total. So you can obviously have somebody choose your shipping charge from, let's say, a drop-down menu. If they choose a shipping method, you can have a fixed shipping charge. So for my particular application, since this is a fictional site, I set my shipping charge to just be 8% of the total. So whatever you were charged as your overall total, I did 8% of that as my shipping charge, which means that my overall total would be 1.008 times the total. Both of those are going to be formatted to 2 decimal places. When I multiply 0.08 times anything, chances are I'm going to wind up with some really funky number of decimal places. So this will make sure that they come out to 2 decimal places. End those rows. Then the last thing I'm going to want to do is end my overall table. So I want to have that outside my if statement because I'm going to end the table the same way for both different versions of my shopping cart, where I'm going to write out a footer which has the green bar on the end of the bottom of the table. And that really is the basics of writing out a shopping cart.